The first time I realized an entire neighborhood thought they owned my family's land, I was staring at a wooden sign nailed into one of my grandfather's oak trees. Not near the tree, not beside it, actually nailed into it. The sign read Cedar Ridge Community Nature Preserve. The funny thing was, Cedar Ridge didn't own a single inch of that preserve. I did. Or at least, I had inherited it a few months earlier without even knowing it existed. Looking back now, that's probably the moment this whole story really started. But to explain how a homeowners association accidentally picked a fight over 300 acres of land, I have to go back to the day my grandfather passed away. My grandfather, Walter Mercer, wasn't the kind of man who talked much about money. If you met him, you'd think he was just another retired mechanic who spent his afternoons fishing and drinking black coffee on a creaky porch. He drove an old pickup truck that looked older than I was, wore the same faded work jacket every winter, and never seemed interested in impressing anybody. So when the family gathered for the reading of his will, nobody expected surprises. We assumed there'd be the house, a little savings account, maybe some family keepsakes. That was it. Then the attorney cleared his throat and started talking about a parcel of land. At first I thought maybe 10 acres, maybe 20. Then he said 300 acres. The room got quiet enough to hear the air conditioner running. My aunt actually laughed because she thought he'd misspoken. He hadn't. Apparently, my great-grandfather had purchased the property decades earlier when the entire area was mostly farmland and timber. Over the years, the surrounding region exploded with development. Shopping centers arrived, highways expanded, subdivisions spread across former pastures. But somehow those 300 wooded acres remained untouched. The title had passed quietly through generations until it landed in my lap. A few weeks later, I decided to visit. Honestly, I wasn't expecting much. I imagined overgrown woods and maybe a few old hunting trails. Instead, what I found confused me almost immediately. The property sat directly behind a large subdivision called Cedar Ridge Estates, one of those upscale developments where every mailbox matches and every lawn looks professionally maintained. The houses were beautiful, I'll give them that. Large brick homes, decorative stone entrances, manicured landscaping everywhere. As I drove through the area, I noticed something interesting. Real estate signs advertised homes backing to protected green space and exclusive nature views. At the time, I didn't think much about it. Then I reached the boundary. The first thing I saw was a trailhead. Not an old trail. A maintained trail. Gravel path. Directional markers. Fresh mulch. Benches. Somebody had spent money building this. I parked and started walking. The deeper I went, the stranger it got. There were trail maps mounted on posts. Small wooden bridges crossing drainage areas. Picnic tables. Bird-watching stations. It looked less like private land and more like a public park. I remember standing there thinking, who exactly paid for all this? Because it certainly wasn't my grandfather. Then I found the sign. Cedar Ridge Community Nature Preserve. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I looked around and saw additional signs further down the trail. Every single one carried HOA branding. That's when something clicked. These people didn't think they were borrowing the land. They thought it belonged to them. Later that week, I started digging through county records and old documents. What I discovered was surprisingly simple. The subdivision had been built right up against my family's property line almost 20 years earlier. Over time, residents started walking into the woods. Then they created trails. Then the HOA maintained the trails. Then real estate agents began marketing the forest as an unofficial neighborhood amenity. Eventually, everyone just accepted the story that the woods were part of the community. Nobody bothered verifying it because nobody had a reason to question it. The actual owner, my grandfather, rarely visited the property and never complained. As far as the neighborhood knew, the forest was simply there. Free. Permanent. Available. The more I learned, the more conflicted I felt. Part of me understood why the residents enjoyed the space. It was beautiful. Tall hardwoods, wildlife everywhere, quiet streams winding through the trees. Another part of me couldn't ignore the fact that an entire organization had effectively claimed property they didn't own. So I decided to handle things politely. No lawyers. No threats. No drama. I hired a survey company, gathered the records, and drafted a respectful letter to the HOA board explaining that I had inherited the property and would appreciate removal of any signs, structures, and materials suggesting HOA ownership. Honestly, I expected an apology, maybe a little embarrassment. Instead, 2 weeks later, I received a response that changed everything. The letter wasn't hostile. In some ways that made it worse. The board thanked me for reaching out, and then calmly explained that residents had used and maintained the land for many years and considered it a valued part of the community. Considered it a valued part of the community. I must have read that sentence 5 times. There wasn't a single acknowledgement that they didn't own it. No apology. No offer to remove the signs. Just a carefully worded explanation of why they believed their use somehow mattered. Sitting at my kitchen table that night, I felt something shift. Up until then, I thought I was correcting a misunderstanding. Now I realized I might be dealing with people who genuinely believed long-term use gave them rights they never legally had. And that realization became even clearer a month later when bright orange survey markers appeared across the property and the HOA president showed up in person to see them. The morning the survey crews finished marking the boundaries, I drove out to the property expecting a quiet walk through the woods. Instead, I found 3 people standing near the main trail entrance staring at the bright orange stakes like they were looking at crime scene evidence. One of them was a woman I recognized from the HOA website, Sharon Whitmore, the president of Cedar Ridge Estates. She was dressed like she had just stepped out of a board meeting, holding a folder under one arm and wearing the expression of someone who was already irritated before the conversation even began. As I got out of my truck, she looked at me, then at the survey markers, then back at me. "You're really doing this?" she asked. I remember blinking because I honestly wasn't sure what she meant. "Doing what?" I said. She pointed toward the woods. "Claiming all of this." For a second I thought she was joking. "I'm not claiming it," I replied. "I inherited it." One of the other residents folded his arms and shook his head. "We've been using these trails for 15 years. I nodded. "I know." "Then surely you understand why people aren't happy." What struck me wasn't the anger. It was the certainty. They weren't speaking like neighbors discussing a misunderstanding. They were speaking like people confronting someone who had taken something away from them. The conversation stayed civil, but the tone underneath it was becoming obvious. Sharon eventually looked at the survey stakes and said, "There are families here who moved into this neighborhood because of access to these woods." I answered honestly. Then whoever sold those houses should have been more careful about what they promised. That didn't go over well. She tightened her jaw, gathered her folder, and left without another word. Over the next several weeks things became increasingly strange. Residents continued entering the property despite receiving notices explaining the ownership situation. Some acted embarrassed when they saw me. Others acted annoyed. One afternoon, I encountered a man walking his dog nearly half a mile inside the property. When I politely explained that the land was private, he laughed and said, "Private according to who?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. "According to the county records, the survey, the deed, and about 70 years of documented ownership." He wasn't laughing by the time he left. What bothered me most wasn't the trespassing itself. It was the attitude behind it. People seemed unable to separate familiarity from ownership. Because they had used something for years, they assumed they were entitled to continue using it forever. Around that time I started spending more weekends exploring the property. The more I walked it, the more attached I became. My grandfather had never talked much about the land, but being there made me understand why he held on to it. The forest wasn't just acreage. It was an ecosystem. Deer trails crossed through old-growth sections. Wild turkeys moved through open clearings. Several streams cut through the property. There were places so quiet you could hear leaves falling. The longer I spent there, the less interested I became in simply selling it. Then one afternoon I had lunch with an old college friend named Ethan who worked in environmental planning. I told him everything that had happened. The HOA, the trails, the survey dispute, the strange sense of entitlement. He listened quietly before asking a question I hadn't considered. "What are you actually planning to do with the land?" I shrugged. "I don't know yet." He leaned back in his chair. "You should." "Why?" "Because if you don't create a vision for it, someone else will." That sentence stuck with me. A few days later, he invited me to meet a conservation consultant he worked with. We spent nearly 4 hours walking portions of the property, discussing possibilities. Managed hiking, wildlife conservation, educational programs, seasonal camping permits, controlled recreation, habitat restoration projects. By the end of the day, something had changed. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about defending the land. I was thinking about building something with it. Over the following months, I invested more time than I ever expected. I met with county officials, reviewed zoning classifications, studied environmental regulations. To my surprise, the property's mixed-use agricultural designation created opportunities. Certain recreational activities could be permitted with proper planning. Nothing massive. No amusement park. No commercial overdevelopment. But a carefully managed outdoor recreation preserve was entirely possible. The idea excited me because it solved multiple problems at once. The land would remain protected. Public access would be controlled. Revenue could support maintenance and conservation. Most importantly, ownership would finally be respected. As plans developed, word spread through the neighborhood. That's when the resistance escalated. HOA meetings suddenly included discussions about the property. Rumors circulated that I intended to destroy the forest. One resident claimed I was planning luxury cabins throughout the woods. Another insisted I wanted to clear-cut hundreds of acres. None of it was true. Every proposal emphasized conservation. But facts rarely travel as fast as fear. Eventually, Sharon requested a formal meeting. We met at a local coffee shop. She arrived carrying a thick binder filled with documents. I brought a folder containing surveys, permits, and land records. The contrast felt symbolic. After a few minutes of small talk, she got straight to the point. The board is concerned about your plans. Which plans? I asked. The recreation project. I slid several documents across the table. You've seen the proposals. She glanced at them without opening them. People feel like they're losing something important. I took a sip of coffee. I understand that. Do you? She asked. Because many residents believe this forest belongs to the community. I couldn't help smiling slightly. Believing something doesn't make it true. Her expression hardened. That's a very legal way of looking at it. Ownership is usually legal. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she lowered her voice. You know, there are attorneys who think long-term community use creates rights. There it was. The threat hidden beneath the conversation. I nodded slowly. My attorney disagrees. Her eyes narrowed. So you're prepared for a legal fight? I thought about that question carefully before answering. No. I'm prepared for responsible land management. If someone wants a legal fight, that's their decision. We left the meeting without reaching any agreement. A week later, I received a letter from the HOA's attorney suggesting the possibility of implied access rights and community reliance arguments. My lawyer practically laughed when he read it. He spent an hour explaining why their position was incredibly weak. Adverse possession requirements hadn't been met. No recorded easements existed. Unauthorized maintenance didn't create ownership interests. Long-term assumptions weren't legal documents. For the first time since inheriting the property, I felt confident the situation wasn't actually complicated. It was emotional, not legal. And emotions tend to intensify when reality refuses to cooperate. Construction began shortly afterward. The first visible change was a gate at the primary trail entrance. Not a huge gate, not an aggressive one. Just a clean, professionally installed entrance designed to regulate access. The day it went up, neighborhood social media exploded. Photos appeared online within hours. Comments poured in. Some accused me of greed. Others accused me of ruining the community. A few called me selfish. One resident actually wrote that I was stealing nature from families. That one made me laugh because I was fairly certain nature had been sitting there long before any of us arrived. The following Saturday, I drove out to inspect the installation. About 20 residents had gathered near the entrance. Some stood quietly. Others looked openly angry. Sharon was there too. As I approached, she pointed toward the gate. This isn't how neighbors treat each other. I looked around at the crowd before answering. Neither is putting your signs on someone else's trees. Several people looked away. Others shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, I sensed doubt spreading through the group. Not everyone agreed with the board anymore. Some residents were beginning to realize the facts weren't on their side. The gate remained. Access stopped. And as summer turned into fall, the project moved toward its official opening date. What nobody expected was what happened next. Because once the preserve finally opened to the public, the people who had fought hardest against it became the very first customers. Opening day arrived on a cool October morning, and I'll admit I was nervous. For nearly a year, my life had revolved around surveys, permits, meetings, attorneys, conservation plans, and an endless stream of HOA drama that seemed determined to turn a simple property inheritance into a neighborhood civil war. Standing near the entrance that morning, Watching the first visitors arrive, I wondered if all the effort had been worth it. Then families started walking through the gate. Hikers checked in at the welcome station. Birdwatchers picked up trail maps. Campers loaded gear onto carts. Kids pointed excitedly toward the woods. And for the first time since inheriting the land, I wasn't thinking about ownership disputes anymore. I was thinking about possibilities. Over the next few months, the preserve exceeded every expectation. Entry fees funded trail maintenance. Habitat restoration projects improved several damaged areas. We installed educational signs about local wildlife. Controlled access reduced litter and vandalism. Fire prevention programs helped protect vulnerable sections of the forest. The land was healthier than it had been in decades. Ironically, some of the most enthusiastic visitors came from Cedar Ridge estates. At first, I only noticed a few familiar faces. Then more started appearing. Eventually, annual passes became surprisingly popular among HOA residents. One Saturday morning, I was helping a volunteer group clear invasive plants when a familiar voice called my name. I turned around and found Sharon standing near the trailhead. For a second, I thought we were about to start another argument. Instead, she held up an annual pass and gave a reluctant smile. My husband bought these. I looked at the pass. Good choice. She rolled her eyes. Don't enjoy this too much. Too late. To my surprise, she laughed. Not a forced laugh. A real one. Then she looked around at the forest and shook her head. I still think this whole thing could have been handled differently. I nodded. Maybe. She crossed her arms. But the trails do look better. Coming from her, that was practically a public apology. As she walked away, I realized something important. Most of the residents had never been the real problem. They were operating on assumptions they had been given for years. They bought homes advertised beside green space. They were told the woods were part of the community experience. They built memories there. The deeper issue was what happened when those assumptions collided with reality. Somewhere along the way, people stopped distinguishing between access and ownership. They convinced themselves that using something long enough somehow transformed it into theirs. And when that belief was challenged, they reacted exactly the way people often do when expectations meet facts they don't like. Looking back now, I don't feel angry anymore. Honestly, I understand why emotions ran high. Imagine believing a beautiful forest belongs to your neighborhood for 15 years, only to discover it never did. That's a difficult thing to accept. But ownership matters. Boundaries matter. Respect matters. If the situation had been reversed, nobody in Cedar Ridge would have accepted strangers claiming rights to their backyard simply because they had walked through it for a decade. The same principle applied here. A year after opening, the preserve was thriving. Wildlife populations improved. Visitor numbers remained strong. Educational programs partnered with local schools. Conservation grants helped fund additional restoration work. What started as an inheritance had evolved into something far more meaningful than I ever expected. Sometimes I still walk the trails alone in the early morning before visitors arrive. The forest is quiet then, just birds calling through the trees and sunlight filtering between the branches. During those walks, I often think about my grandfather. I wonder if he ever imagined what would happen after he was gone. I wonder what he would think about all the meetings, arguments, surveys, and legal letters that followed. Mostly, though, I think he'd be happy the land is still standing. Not developed, not neglected, protected and cared for. As for the HOA, life eventually moved on. New board members replaced old ones. The controversy faded. People adapted. They always do. But every now and then, when I pass the entrance gate and see families enjoying the preserve, I remember that first sign nailed into my grandfather's tree in the neighborhood that genuinely believed 300 acres belonged to them. They never expected the owner to show up. They definitely never expected him to keep the land. And they certainly never expected him to turn it into something better than what they had before. But that's exactly what happened. Now I'm curious what you think. If you had lived in that neighborhood, would you have sided with the HOA residents who felt they lost something important? Or would you have supported the property owner's right to take control of his own land? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always divide people right down the middle. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates a good property dispute where reality ended up being far stranger than anyone expected.